you look at PwC's list of, the main economies up to 2050, I mean, again, it's like a lot of forecasts. We can only take them so far. It's 30 years away. But a lot of those nations rising to the top 20 are what are now developing nations and are going to need that level of development that you've just mentioned in order to meet the aspirations of their populations. And it's sometimes not even aspirations, just basic energy security, basic shelter safety, basic means to live a safe life, and then the economic aspirations on top of that many of us already enjoy. Do you see this being a huge point for the 2020s? Do you see this as something that, if you had your wish list, do you see this as something you really think needs to, because without fixing this, surely we're not going to get, all other efforts aside, without fixing this, we won't get to that point by mid-century?
I think this is, in many ways, the critical issue. We need to avoid that there becomes a new dividing line between, advanced economies and some others that are moving ahead very quickly, and developing economies that don't have the same access to finance and the technologies that they will need to move ahead in a different way to the one that has been historically the case for those that have built up their national infrastructure already.
And when you say about,
so there's that's why we come back again to this question of finance. That's obviously in the focus in the run-up to COP. This notion of a developed country, the $100 billion figure that apparently is getting close to being met in the run-up to Glasgow. But in our view, that's very much a sort of floor rather than a ceiling. And there's all sorts of other things that need to be put in place as well. It's not just the volume of finance, it's how it's used, how it's delivered, how quickly it's delivered, and what are the accompanying measures that are taken in many of the countries concerned in order to facilitate some of the investments in power, in infrastructure, in industrial decarbonization and elsewhere, that will point the whole energy system in a slightly different direction.
And how to support that level of localization as well. The idea that they'll be able to, as the years go on, take this on for themselves and not have to be reliant as reliant on some of these financing packages as the century rolls on. And it's that dividing line you mentioned, which isn't just with decarbonization, but also digitalization, and making sure that chasm, which is already very much there, doesn't get any wider. And I'd be interested to hear what you think on the carbon pricing side. Unfortunately, I think we'll have to wrap up after this, because I've already taken up more than your time than I promised, but there's so much to say. When we talk about economic outlooks, of course, we have to talk about carbon pricing, especially with the COP just around the corner. And obviously, this is a decades-long conversation. 2 carbon pricing initiatives in 1990, 64 today. This is according to the World Bank, all of varying degrees of success and depth and accountability as well. But progress is definitely being made, although it has been very hard won. I asked you just now about your wish list. But if you had your wish list for carbon pricing at COP, what sort of progress would you like to see made? How integral to progress overall for decarbonisation do you think it is?
I think it clearly makes a difference. I mean, we've seen many examples of that in Europe, in the way that a carbon price has helped to move away from more polluting technologies in the power sector. You can see some evidence of that also in industry. In our view, carbon pricing is one of the key tools, but it takes its place alongside other regulatory measures and other support measures that governments can put in place. Because the carbon price is good for many things. It's not very, very good. It's not been proven to be good at bringing forward new innovative technologies.
No.
And likewise, it's worked well in power. It can work in industry. It's not obvious that a high carbon price is the way to shift technology choices in the transport sector, or for residential energy use. It's quite a blunt instrument to do that, and all sorts of distributional questions arise about impacts on vulnerable parts of the population and so on. So I think you have to see that there are multiple market failures that prevent us from dealing adequately with climate change. That carbon prices can deal with some of them, but it can't deal with all of them. So I think you have to see it as part of a portfolio of responses that we're looking to leaders at COP to provide.
And how do you think it could work or support developing nations' carbon pricing, development of carbon pricing initiatives in this decade? What impact do you think that could have on developing nations?
I think in the case of developing economies, affordability is always going to be like very close to the top of the list for policymakers. And in many cases, in a sense, you still have the opposite of carbon pricing. You have subsidies for fossil fuel consumption. So, I mean, that'll be the first issue to deal with. You have to actually remove some of the subsidies that apply to fossil fuels in the market today. And then you can start thinking about putting additional measures in place that reflect also the environmental externalities. But in the case of developing economies, those countries that have moved ahead, I mean, India is a good example. It's moved ahead in the power sector with a vision of what needs to be done, a set of regulatory measures that allow for investment in solar, in wind, in other technologies. And so there are, we shouldn't imagine that developing economies in particular need to reach for carbon pricing immediately as the way to move everything forward. There are many demonstrated examples of policies that work, that have been tried and tested in many parts of the world, and that can be applied more widely to get renewables into the system and to get some of the other measures going.
And just before we wrap up, how do you feel about the report on a personal basis? Are you optimistic? Are you tentatively optimistic? Are you concerned? Where would you, you as a principal author, I imagine, you're involved with the language of the stubbornness of the status quo, which suggests frustrated. Where do you stand?
So first of all, I think, we have to recognize that there's a lot happening. Yes. There is an enormous amount that shows that there is the potential for growth and employment that's associated with this new global energy economy. That said, we are not close to being on track for the sorts of things that needs to be done for the vulnerable balance of our planet. A lot of the things that we think could be done in addition, they don't require a leap of imagination. This means running with the things that we know work. There are mature technologies that offer ways to reduce emissions in the power sector. There are proven, efficient appliances and efficiency measures that you can use to deploy to tackle some of the demand side issues. Reducing methane emissions from fossil fuel operations. That's not a technically complex task. That just requires the application of sensible measures for some of your above ground operations. So I think we need to have in mind that we're not talking about things that are beyond the imagination of policymakers, regulators, companies today.
Which in itself
it's a question
is
of
a great
application.
Relief.
We need to run with the things that we know work, and where we don't have the tools, we need to spend the 2020s in building up the possibility for advanced battery technology or hydrogen value chains or some of the other things that we know that we're going to need, but which are still not ready in terms of costs for large scale deployment for the moment. We need to bring those costs down this decade, yes. But there's plenty of other stuff that is perfectly cost effective that we could be doing much more of in order to meet rising demand for energy, but also bringing emissions down sharply.
Indeed, those excuses of the wait and see game, or we can't afford that, or we don't have the knowledge for that, or we don't know where to start, all of that has certainly passed. There are enough tools and there are enough options out there for people to get the guidance they need to seize those low-hanging fruits, as you say. Tim, thank you very much for speaking with us. I know we've taken a bit more time than we promised, but there is so much to say in this report, and I'm halfway through it at the moment, and I'll read the other half over the next couple of days. But it must have been a real labour for you and the team. So congratulations that it's off your desk now to a degree, and we hope to speak to you again soon.
Well, good luck with the rest of it, Michelle, and very happy to speak. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you, Tim. Take care. Bye. Bye.